E.W.F. Hegel was certainly one of the most important and profound philosophers of the last 200 years, one whose influence has extended to almost every branch of philosophy and almost every branch of the human sciences. He's particularly important as a philosopher of history. We'll see he's really the father of modern historicism and idealism. But I would urge that part of what motivated Hegel's analysis of history was that in history he saw a counterexample to the mechanistic materialism that had characterized the Enlightenment. And in that way, Hegel's idealism and historicism represents a romantic reaction against the excesses of the Enlightenment. What do we mean by that? First, I want to unpack that word historicism. Hegel's historicism lies in his realization that history, unlike what the Enlightenment had argued, does not exemplify the kind of mathematical laws found in physics. Rather, history is a developmental process where the standards and parameters of actions and interpretation change, grow, and develop over time. Thus, historicism, and particularly Hegel's historicism, insists there is no mathematical, rational, or super-historical vantage point from which we can judge historical action and historical events. Right? We must always look at the past in its own terms. Hegel was the first to bring us to understand the anachronism of Enlightenment critiques of the past. Now, to say Hegel is an idealist is to point out that what develops over time in history is intelligence, culture, mind, if you will, what he called spirit. Which is to say, it is our ideas, it's our culture, it's our mentalities which develop in time, both in history and in biography, in each of our own individual experiences. And it is that part of nature or of the world, our idea, our cultures, our minds, that the historian is concerned with. So we'll look to see these two important themes of historicism and idealism unfold in the account of Hegel's philosophy of history. Now, although it's incredibly important, Hegel's philosophy of history is also incredibly abstruse and difficult to understand. In part, that's because Hegel's work comprised what he calls an absolute perspective, which is to say, Hegel would claim you can't understand anything he's written until you've read and understood everything he's written. Okay. Well, I would argue that, in a sense, this is correct precisely because Hegel has a tendency to use language in a way that we're not accustomed to, and that his language literally makes up what we might call the interlocking parts of a Rubik's cube. So, for example, I could very easily summarize all of Hegel's philosophy of history in 4 sentences, and they would be the following. 1. History is the dialectical process whereby spirit comes to know itself and realizes its idea. 2. Freedom is the idea of spirit, and spirit is reason in and for itself. 3. The means of this realization, or cunning of reason, is the passions of the individual as both subject and object of history, and its form is the state. And finally, 4. The national spirit is a moment in the development of the world spirit, and for each such moment, as for all, the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the setting of dusk. Now, these sentences really do adequately describe Hegel's theory. They're also completely impenetrable. If any of you understand them, you're either incredibly brilliant or slightly mad. The reason they're impenetrable is because Hegel is using words we think we recognize in peculiar and technical ways. So what I want to do in this lecture is to unpack each of these sentences by trying to translate Hegelian terminology into something close to everyday vernacular English. Having done that, then we'll have an opportunity, time permitting, to look at what are some of the implications and consequences of Hegel's philosophy of history. So let's begin with that first sentence. Let me repeat it. History is the dialectical process whereby spirit comes to know itself and realizes its idea. First thing to keep in mind, when Hegel speaks of history, he always means world history, philosophically conceived. He's thinking about the sum of human experiences as understood under a rational conception. And as Hegel says, if you look at the world rationally, it looks back rationally. And that's the job of the philosopher of history, to find the rational principle one finds uncovered in that development. So history is world history. What does this word dialectical process mean? You're going to hear that phrase a lot. Hegel uses it, and other Hegelians, like Marxists, use it as well. You may have heard of the famous analysis of the, quote, dialectic into its three moments: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That, too, probably doesn't shed a lot of light for you. I think the best way to understand it is to look at concrete examples that illustrate what we mean by this dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and then the synthesis of the two. Well, one of the classic triads of thesis, antithesis, synthesis is that between undifferentiated unity, differentiated disunity, and their synthesis in differentiated unity. And again, I don't expect this to mean a lot to you until I can cash it in terms of examples. So let me give you an example of undifferentiated unity. And that is the normal nuclear family. It's a unity in that it's bound by affection and love. It's undifferentiated in that the principles that make it up are not separable into atomic individualism, which is to say, it's a unity which is not broken down into distinct individuals, each of whom has their own selfish interests. Within the family, we assume that every member of the family is interested in the good of that unity, hence undifferentiated unity. Its antithesis, its Hegelian dialectical opposite, would be civil society, the civil society of the economic marketplace, in which we have differentiated disunity, by which we mean that civil society, the economic marketplace, is made up of differentiated individuals, atomic individuals, each with their own particular interests, goals, and agendas. And it forms a disunity in the sense that those interests come into conflict with one another. And in fact, that conflict is competitive. And what benefits one agent may in fact harm another. So there we have two opposites: the differentiated unity, the undifferentiated unity of the family, the differentiated disunity of civil society. How are they synthesized? In a differentiated unity, which Hegel finds in the state, right? Because the state, on the one hand, keeps us differentiated. We're each legal persons, legal individuals, and yet it does make up a unity insofar as laws are created to make sure that our interests always benefit that of the larger public good, that our actions always act for the good of society as a whole. So that then is a differentiated unity. Note, both of the previous moments of that synthesis persist in that final synthetic moment. So civil society, the state is made up of families and the economic marketplace of civil society at the same time. They're simply subsumed within this larger synthesis. So that's pretty much, I think, a good example of what we mean by the dialectic: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Okay, so we're almost through this first sentence. We still have to explain the word spirit. Well, spirit, which, since we're talking about world history, will always be referred to as world spirit, is, in short, the agent and subject of history. Well, that may also seem strange. Essentially, Hegel's talking about what we might call collective subjectivity. We might think of this in terms of national spirits. Such national spirits are, as it were, the sort of set of characteristics that characterize a people. This, in fact, was one of the great breakthroughs of the early 19th century in terms of history. A host of philosophers, Herder among them, had discovered that there are, in fact, distinct national characters. That Englishmen have different propensities about authority than, say, Prussians. That Italians have a different sense of authority than, say, Frenchmen. And that Scots have a different set of attributes with regard to economic activity than, say, Spaniards. And this was something which, in the early 19th century, helped create the very sort of locus for nationalism and the emergence of national consciousness. And that's very much what Hegel's about when he talks about national spirits, which are moments in world spirit. Again, it's a peculiar notion for us because we usually don't think in terms of collective subjects. But I say usually because there are still cases in which we do. Take our legal culture. When we have a criminal case, it is always Jeffrey Dahmer versus the people of Michigan. And that's that collective subject. When we describe the Second World War, we don't say that the Emperor of Japan declared war on Franklin Roosevelt. We say Japan attacked the United States. And again, we're looking at that collective subjectivity. And the essential notion is it's that which informs national character. Okay, so now we're down to that last three words of the sentence. History is the dialectical process whereby spirit comes to know itself and realizes its idea. To realize is actually the most straightforward word in that whole sentence. For Hegel, to realize is to make real. And the point of contrast here is real or actual as opposed to potential. Aristotle is the key backdrop here. So a child is potentially an adult. Given the right conditions, it can become an adult. Hegel would say it realizes its adulthood. It makes real its adulthood with the right conditions. And that word idea for Hegel means essence. So, world history then is this system of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis where culture or national minds come to know themselves and make real their essence. Okay. Well, what is that essence? That turns up in the next sentence, which we turn to now, which states that freedom is the idea of spirit, and spirit is reason in and for itself. What do we mean by reason? Hegel means abstract rationality, the sort of structure or order of intelligence that we find in the universe, both in the natural world, in the immanent laws of physics, and in the cultural world in the realm of philosophy and abstraction. For Hegel, this is the philosophical expression of what religious people mean by God. Right? It's the essential notion of a rationality behind the realm of phenomena. Hegel calls this abstract quality in itself. So when he says freedom is the idea of spirit, he means freedom is the essence of spirit, and spirit is reason in itself in the sense in which spirit is this abstract rationality. Its dialectical antithesis to this abstract reason that we find in culture, or in the idea of God prior to creation, an abstract logos as it were, its dialectical antithesis is nature, which Hegel calls reason out of itself. What does he mean by that? It's just as rational as, say, the mind of God, but it's rational in an unself-conscious way, which is to say the universe does follow mathematical laws. It does disclose a form of rationality, but the universe itself is not aware of that. So the synthesis of these two, which is spirit, or the collective mind of man, is reason in and for itself. It's a reason which is both aware of its abstract nature, both also aware of the fact that it follows mathematical laws without its own volition, and those two together combine to create the self-consciousness of man realizing that he is distinct from the rest of the animal creation, that he is that part of the universe which both follows mathematical laws and is capable of formulating laws for him or herself. And Hegel calls this reason in and for itself. Okay. Finally, let me get to the first word of the sentence, which I left out to the end. Freedom. What does he mean by freedom? This is very important for Hegel. Hegel does not mean what the Anglo-American tradition calls liberty. He doesn't mean freedom from the control of the state. Rather, he means by it what Kant meant by the phrase autonomy, self-law-making. So man is free to the extent that he creates his own laws for himself, that he creates his own mores and norms for himself. In that sense, his freedom is following his true nature, his true essence. which is the ability to rationally stipulate his own codes of conduct. Okay, so that gives us our second sentence. Let's turn to the third sentence, and this one gets a little bit knotty. The means of this realization, or cunning of reason, is the passions of the individual as both subject and object of history, and its form is the state. All right. Hegel means by passion self-interested action. He doesn't mean lust or greed or avarice. He rather means the sort of activity we find in an animal, or in this case a human, that follows its own self-interest. Anytime that self-interest seizes or animates your will, Hegel says you are subject to passion. And again, it's a very Kantian notion. It means that your interests, which are determined by the social circumstances, every time you follow those interests, your actions are being determined by forces outside of you. And that's what he means by passion, as opposed to a rational deliberation coming from within, based on pure abstract rationality, which would be freedom. A healthy state, or a happy state, is one in which the common good is fulfilled by our pursuing our passions. Okay, so we got the first part of that sentence. We know what the passions are. What does he mean by the individual as subject of history? And here Hegel refers to what we might call the great man theory of history. Right? Figures like Caesar, Alexander, Napoleon, Martin Luther. Figures who transformed world history and moved what he calls world spirit forward. How does this happen? Well, Hegel argues that the great man actually serves the individual as subject of history, as it were, serves an important historical function. As a nation or culture develops and its mores and institutions become set, sometimes the circumstances of that culture outstrip those mores and institutions, and fundamental changes are necessary. But they can't be made from within the culture of that society, precisely because those mores are in conflict with these changes. Then what happens is a great man steps forward who changes fundamentally our mores and our practices. This is what Martin Luther did, obviously, though we could think of Julius Caesar doing this as well. Right? The mores that he had inherited were those of Republican Rome. But the rise of the latifundia, the decline of the independent peasantry, and the growth of Roman power had meant that all those institutions of Republican Rome no longer created stable governance. And so he instituted the great reforms which were necessary to move world history forward. He created the great Roman Empire with himself as first citizen, thus setting up what would finally become best exemplified under the reign of the divine Augustus. The key for Hegel is that these individuals move the world spirit forward by creating these new mores, these new circumstances, by sacrificing their own happiness to their passions. In other words, Caesar did not institute the reforms he did because he thought they were right. Caesar was driven by self-interest. He wanted to be dictator of Rome. The only way he could achieve that was to solve the problems that the historical situation had presented to him. Similarly, we might think of Napoleon, who has that same overweening will to power, that same passion, that same self-interest. In order to become the undisputed emperor of Europe, he was forced to reform the legal codes of those countries he conquered, and therefore modernize and secularize them and institute the modern lineaments of civil society and the nation state. Not because he thought they were the right thing to do, but because they were necessary to hold power. And in Hegel's view, this is the world spirit using the great man and his passions to create progress. Okay. This is part of the cunning of reason, because it uses the great man for the advance of spirit, while their motives are almost always selfish and practical. And moreover, all of these great men will suffer tragic ends. They will never achieve the happiness that they seek, but they will nonetheless help move history forward. Now, what do we mean by the individual as object? And this is where the philosophy begins to take on a somewhat troubling aspect. He means the rest of us. Those who are private individuals and are, and I think Hegel's quite right to see it this way, the victims of history. Because if we think of what the great events of history are, famines, plagues, and of course wars, most of us experience those things as calamities and as tragedies. History happens to us when we are the individuals as object of history. And it is a calamity. But here, too, this is part of the cunning of history. These changes, transformations from a medieval order to a modern secular order, all require immense suffering. But the spirit never suffers. That's the cunning of reason. We suffer so that the spirit needn't. Okay. Finally, what does he mean by a state? Well, he means in part what we mean, a government, but I think he means more than that. He also means the culture of a people, its organizing principles, its mores, that which allows for the integration of the individual into a civil society, into a family, or a state, each of which are sort of expressions of the morality and law, which Hegel thinks is the very essence of a state. So, for Hegel, the state's not just the government, it's the foundation for religion, art, and, of course, science. All right, I want to turn now to the last sentence, the one that states, "The national spirit is a moment in the development of the world spirit. And for each such moment, as for all, the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the setting of dusk." Okay. This basic point Hegel wants to make is that spirit, or culture as it were, comes to an awareness of its essential freedom, the fact that it creates itself on the basis of an abstract rationality, in the minds of men in history, through their actions, in their antithesis, nature. And each stage of this growing awareness that man is in fact a realm of ends in and of themselves is exemplified in a particular people or nation, which at that moment is the highest expression of the world spirit. So it is, as it were, the world spirit works its way through discrete national spirits, jumping from place to place in the world. Okay. For Hegel, this must begin with the state, or an organized community, because only there is the question of morality and abstract law first cognizable, or first realizable. So for Hegel, history begins with Oriental civilizations, Sumer, Egypt, Babylon. They developed the insight that one is free, meaning the absolute despot of those states, who is often considered an incarnation of the deity, is himself understood to be free in the sense of an entity which is capable of legislating for himself. Yet even here, this is not a full notion of freedom, in part because only one is free. Only the pharaoh is free. Only the cosmocratic king of Babylon is free. Everyone else is a slave. Moreover, even this freedom turns out to be really the capricious whim of a despot who is likely to be overcome not by rational deliberations, but in fact by his own self-interests and his own passions. Hence, it is a very sketchy notion of freedom. So from these Oriental civilizations, the world spirit moves to its next stage, where it gets a greater understanding of freedom, and that is Greek and Roman society. The Greeks and Romans were the first to learn a greater extent of freedom, namely that some are free. Right? And in their case, their distinction between nature and reason that they develop is in fact too absolute. What do we mean by saying some are free? Well, we mean by that in Greek and Roman society, freedom was in fact extended to a very small percentage of the overall community, those who were citizens. The vast bulk of Athenians were in fact not citizens. They were either freedmen, metis, or they were in fact slaves. Similarly, in Roman society, the vast bulk of people living in Roman Italy were slaves or freedmen, but not citizens. Only the citizens were free because only the citizens could create law, could become that rational deliberative agency. So there we find again, it's a progress on the earlier notion where one is free, but it's still limited. Some are free, a few are free, the lucky citizens. It's only with the Germanic peoples, by which he means the Northern Europeans, through their experience of Christianity, that man comes to understand, or better yet, world spirit comes to understand, that all men are free. Right? And this is because Christianity teaches that essential notion of the dignity of all man and the equality of all man. That all men are capable of, in theory at least, legislating for themselves in a Kantian autonomous fashion. Okay. Now I want to turn to the last phrase of that last sentence that says, the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the setting of dusk. It's actually a paraphrase of a much larger phrase that Hegel liked to use about history, paints its gray on gray, etc., etc. To sum it up briefly, for Hegel, the owl is always a symbol of wisdom. So the owl of Minerva means, essentially, that historical understanding only comes when something is done. And this is a fairly straightforward notion. We understand an historical action when it's come to a close. As we say, hindsight is 20/20. Thus, to take examples, he would argue, spirit only understands itself after it's finished its action in a particular historical context. The Greeks come to understand that some are free. They come to understand that in their philosophy, literally in the writings of Plato and Aristotle, who first expressed these notions philosophically. They do so only because Greek society, the Greek polis, the locus of that freedom, has run its course. Plato and Aristotle can only write for Hegel after the Peloponnesian Wars because they can only understand the Greek polis now that it's about to be swept aside by the Macedonian Empire. Okay. So we come to understand something only when it's come to an end. All right, what are some of the consequences of this worldview? Well, on the one hand, history becomes indeed what Hegel wanted to be, a strong counterexample to the Enlightenment notion of law-like regularity. Contrary to, for example, Hume, Hegel would say an Englishman is not like a Greek, and a Frenchman is not like a Roman. Each people is different because each people represent a different stage in the development of world spirit. And that obviously is an advantage. It gives us a richer way of understanding history. But at the same time, such historicism also leads to historical relativism. Because we can have no specific conception of any absolute or reason in itself outside of its manifestation in space and time, all we have is its particular level of historical evolution as embodied in one national spirit or another. Thus, the very canons of rationality and morality shift over time, and there is no grounds for criticizing them from a super-historical point of view. Which means, strangely enough, that we cannot criticize 16th century Europe for its intolerance, because that is anachronistic. That was a later development of world spirit. Okay. Another implication that I think comes directly from this sort of historical relativism is that Hegel's philosophy can be intensely conservative, nationalistic, militaristic, and statist. And this is not coincidental. In fact, Prussia at the time had experienced no small amount of student radicalism. Hegel was hired by the Prussian state to be their court philosopher and to preach to these young student radicals and convince them of the errors of their ways. And he was thoroughly effective. So much so that, in fact, he became, as I've mentioned, the court philosopher of Prussia, in which not only students, but many government officials would come to hear Hegel lecture. And the reason for this, the reason it's so conservative, is precisely because the spirit of a people is an organic growth, which is not subject to utopian criticism. The sort of criticism one found among French revolutionaries is anti-Hegelian. If something is, well, as he puts it, the rational is the real and the real is the rational, which means that if world spirit is going to achieve some goal, i.e. the rational, it will become real, and there is no human agency necessary to bring it about. You can't force that to happen. Whatever the rational or the real is the rational means, whatever now exists is the result of historical evolution. And in that sense, it is about as far as we have gone, to use that expression. So in that sense, it is basically conservative. It says what is right. It's nationalistic because the movement of world spirit doesn't happen through classes or genders, but through nations. And nations are the agency of history. And obviously, given that these are the agencies of history, we know how they're going to resolve their dialectical conflicts. Thesis and antithesis will meet on the battlefield. And war, therefore, becomes the mechanism which moves history forward. Indeed, if some 20th century Hegelians have quipped, the ultimate solution to the left and right-wing interpretations of Hegel's philosophy of history were settled at Stalingrad. And finally, it's statist because it implies that the state is the highest nexus of human freedom. Finally, I want to leave you with this one last troubling conclusion from Hegel. Hegel has claimed the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the setting of dusk. We understand something only when it's come to an end. Hegel claims to understand history with a capital H. In some sense, Hegel must have believed that history had come to a close. And indeed, some might consider this just a tad delusional, even for a Prussian philosopher.